It was supposed to be a routine flight, a quick hop from New York to Miami. The first-class cabin was a haven of luxury, with its plush leather seats, crisp champagne flutes, and soft, ambient lighting. Among the passengers was Vanessa Carter, a woman whose name alone could turn heads in any boardroom around the globe. At just 34 years old, Vanessa wasn't just a billionaire. She was a trailblazer, a symbol of resilience and brilliance, a self-made mogul who had built her empire from the ground up. Her commanding presence was matched by her elegance. A tailored suit, diamond-studded earrings, and a quiet confidence that spoke volumes without saying a word. The whispers began almost immediately. "Is that her?" someone muttered, nudging their companion. Heads turned, eyes widened, and phones discreetly angled for photos. Vanessa, used to the attention, simply adjusted her oversized sunglasses and focused on the book in her lap. She wasn't here to make a scene. She was here to travel, just like everyone else. But not everyone saw it that way. Captain Richard Hale was no stranger to the skies. He was a veteran pilot with decades of experience under his belt and an ego to match. To his colleagues, he was known for his sharp skills and commanding demeanor. But to those who knew him well, there was a darker side, a simmering resentment toward anyone who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. When Richard caught wind of the high-profile passenger in first class, something shifted. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was prejudice, maybe it was both. Whatever it was, it gnawed at him as he walked through the terminal toward the cockpit. He glanced at Vanessa as he passed, his eyes lingering just a moment too long. She didn't notice, or at least she pretended not to, but he noticed her. The flight took off without a hitch. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, and the passengers settled into their routines. Vanessa sipped her sparkling water, her attention divided between her book and her tablet, where a flurry of emails awaited her response. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Richard's mood darkened. He muttered something under his breath, something his co-pilot chose to ignore. It started small, a curt announcement over the intercom, his voice laced with an edge of condescension as he addressed the first-class cabin. Most passengers brushed it off, but Vanessa's brow furrowed slightly. Then came the turbulence, not the kind caused by weather, but the kind caused by subtle, deliberate choices. The plane jolted and dipped in ways that felt intentional, calculated. Vanessa pressed the call button for a flight attendant. "Is everything okay up there?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The attendant, a young woman named Maria, offered a nervous smile. "Just a little turbulence, ma'am. Nothing to worry about." But Vanessa wasn't convinced. She had a knack for reading people, and Maria's forced calm told her there was more to the story. Then it happened. Richard made his way into the first-class cabin under the guise of a routine check. He stopped by Vanessa's seat, his posture towering and intimidating. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone teetering on the edge of mockery. Vanessa looked up, unflinching. "Not at all," she replied smoothly, though her eyes said otherwise. But Richard wasn't done. His next words, cutting, offensive, and loud enough for others to hear, sent a hush over the cabin. Gasps echoed as passengers exchanged shocked glances. Vanessa didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened ever so slightly. She met Richard's gaze head-on, her composure unshaken. The moment stretched, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. 2 minutes later, everything changed. As the plane continued its smooth trajectory toward Miami, the air in the first-class cabin remained anything but calm. The tension that Richard had left behind hung heavily over the passengers, most of whom were now entirely distracted from whatever books, movies, or tasks they had been occupying themselves with. The whispers grew louder, the looks more frequent, and the unease almost palpable. Vanessa, meanwhile, kept her outward composure. Her tablet was still in her hands, though her focus had shifted from emails to something far more deliberate. She had sent more than one message, each carefully addressed to the right people, individuals she knew wouldn't let this incident slide. She wasn't one to abuse her power, But the idea of letting Richard's behavior go unchecked didn't sit right with her. She wasn't doing this just for herself. She knew there were countless others who had likely endured similar treatment from people like him, but didn't have the resources or the voice to do anything about it. Vanessa had the power to act, and she wasn't about to waste it. Nearby, a young man in his 20s, dressed in casual but expensive clothing, couldn't help but lean over slightly from his seat to whisper, "That was insane. Are you okay?" His voice was tinged with genuine concern, but also curiosity. Vanessa looked at him, her lips curving into a small, polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied. Her tone was friendly but firm, signaling that she didn't want to dwell on the moment. The man nodded but didn't press further. Still, it was clear he wasn't the only one watching her, wondering what would happen next. In the cockpit, Richard's mood hadn't improved. If anything, it had worsened. His co-pilot, Eric, who had been trying to de-escalate things earlier, now sat in tense silence, focusing on the instruments in front of him. Eric didn't know what to say anymore. The outburst in the cabin had been bad enough, but Richard's simmering anger since then felt even more unsettling. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Eric finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, cautious, as if he were afraid of setting Richard off again. Richard shot him a glare. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. "That woman," Eric said, his tone carefully measured. "Do you even know who she is?" Richard scoffed, his expression hardening. "I don't care who she is," he muttered. "People like her think they can walk all over everyone else just because they've got money. Not on my flight." Eric didn't respond right away. He could see that reasoning with Richard was pointless, but he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Vanessa Carter wasn't just some random passenger. Even if Richard didn't care about her status, Eric knew that their airline would. And if word about this incident got out, which it almost certainly would, it wouldn't just be Richard facing consequences. It could tarnish the reputation of everyone involved, himself included. Back in the cabin, Maria walked briskly toward the galley, her heart pounding. She had been with the airline for years, but she had never seen anything like what had happened today. Her mind raced as she thought about Vanessa and the way Richard had singled her out. Maria had heard stories about him before, of course, whispers among the crew about his temper, his arrogance, and the way he treated certain passengers differently. But seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. Maria paused in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. She had to do something, but what? Reporting a captain wasn't exactly a simple process, and she wasn't sure how much weight her word would carry. But then she thought of Vanessa's calm, composed response to Richard's tirade. Maria admired her strength, the way she hadn't let Richard's words shake her. If Vanessa wasn't afraid to stand up to him, then maybe Maria could do something too. As she stood there, lost in thought, a ping from the intercom startled her. Richard's voice came over the speaker, his tone terse and almost robotic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're beginning our descent into Miami. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened, and we'll have you on the ground shortly." Maria frowned. There was something off about his voice, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Vanessa, too, noticed it. She glanced out the window, watching as the clouds began to thin and the coastline of Florida came into view. The tension in her chest hadn't eased, but she remained as composed as ever. She had done everything she needed to for now, and all she could do was wait. But the waiting didn't last long. As the plane descended, a commotion broke out in the economy cabin. It started as a low murmur, then quickly escalated into raised voices and hurried footsteps. Maria rushed back to investigate, her heart pounding as she navigated the narrow aisle. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. A passenger, visibly upset, gestured toward the back of the plane. "That guy back there, he's having some kind of panic attack or something," the passenger said. Maria hurried toward the man in question, a middle-aged traveler who was clutching his chest and breathing heavily. She knelt beside him, speaking in soothing tones as she tried to assess the situation. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Vanessa's attention was drawn to the unfolding scene. She couldn't hear what was being said, but the sense of urgency was clear. Richard, still in the cockpit, glanced at the commotion through the small monitor that displayed the cabin. "What now?" he muttered, irritation lacing his voice. Eric, however, had a different reaction. "We might need to call for emergency medical services when we land," he said, already reaching for the radio. Richard hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he said curtly. The descent continued, but the mood on the plane was far from ordinary. Between the earlier confrontation and the medical emergency in the back, everyone seemed on edge. Vanessa, however, remained still, her sharp mind processing everything as it happened. She had a feeling this flight was going to end in a way no one expected, but she wasn't afraid. As the plane touched down in Miami and rolled toward the gate, the tension reached its peak. The events of the flight had set something into motion, and Vanessa knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. The question wasn't if, but when. Richard, still oblivious to the storm brewing around him, prepared to disembark. But the moment the plane came to a complete stop, Vanessa's phone buzzed with a message that made her lips curve into the faintest hint of a smile. The game had just begun. The hum of the plane's engines grew quieter as the passengers prepared to disembark. Most of them were visibly restless, their bodies tense from the drama and the medical emergency that had unfolded mid-flight. For Vanessa, though, the quiet chaos of the cabin felt like the calm before the storm. She glanced at her phone one last time, the message she'd received still glowing on the screen. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, but something about this particular situation carried a weight she couldn't quite shake. Maria moved quickly through the cabin, assisting passengers with their belongings and reassuring those who still seemed shaken. Her movements were mechanical, a product of years of training, but her mind was elsewhere. She had been watching Richard throughout the descent, noting the stiffness in his posture and the way he avoided eye contact with anyone. It was as if he knew he had gone too far, but couldn't admit it to himself. Vanessa rose from her seat, her expression unreadable. She collected her belongings with deliberate care, each movement precise. As she made her way toward the exit, a few passengers nodded at her, their silent gestures of solidarity speaking louder than words. She acknowledged them with a polite smile but didn't stop. She had no interest in being a spectacle, even if the confrontation had made her the unwitting center of attention. Richard stood near the cockpit door, his arms crossed. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He was used to being in control, to having the final word, but something about this particular passenger gnawed at him. He didn't know why, but he felt as though he'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. Vanessa didn't spare him a glance as she walked past. She had already decided that her energy was better spent on action, not confrontation. But as she passed him, Richard couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "Entitled people like you always think you are above the rules." The words weren't loud, but they were loud enough for Vanessa to hear. She paused, her back still to him, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. Slowly, she turned her head, meeting his gaze with a calm intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "You'll learn soon enough that respect isn't a privilege, it's a basic expectation," she said evenly. "And the rules you think you're enforcing, they apply to you too." Before Richard could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his jaw tight and his pride wounded. Outside the plane, the scene was anything but ordinary. An ambulance had arrived to assist the passenger who had suffered the medical emergency, and airport staff were bustling around, trying to manage the situation. But it wasn't just the medical team waiting near the gate. A small group of individuals in suits stood nearby, their expressions serious as they scanned the faces of the disembarking passengers. Vanessa stepped into the terminal, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She spotted the group immediately, and they spotted her. One of them, a tall man with a badge clipped to his blazer, stepped forward. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice professional but warm. "We received your message." Vanessa nodded. "Thank you for acting quickly," she replied. The man glanced toward the plane, where Richard was now stepping out. His face paled slightly as he noticed the group of officials waiting. It didn't take long for him to realize that they weren't there for just anyone. They were there for him. "What's this about?" Richard demanded, his voice defensive as he approached. One of the officials stepped forward, holding up a clipboard. "Captain Hale, we need to speak with you regarding an incident that occurred on this flight," he said. Richard's eyes darted toward Vanessa, his expression hardening. "You can't be serious," he said. "This is all because of her." Vanessa didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The officials were already moving to escort Richard away, their calm efficiency leaving no room for argument. The other passengers, now gathered in the terminal, watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. Some of them pulled out their phones, recording the moment, while others exchanged whispers. Maria stood near the gate, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She watched as Richard was led away, her emotions a mix of relief and disbelief. She had always assumed that people like him could get away with anything, but now, for the first time, she saw the possibility of accountability. Vanessa, meanwhile, remained composed. She wasn't gloating or celebrating. This wasn't about revenge for her. It was about ensuring that people like Richard understood that their actions had consequences. As the officials disappeared with Richard, Vanessa turned her attention back to Maria, who was still standing near the gate. Their eyes met, and Maria hesitated before approaching her. "Miss Carter," Maria said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up for yourself, for all of us, really." Vanessa smiled, her expression softening. "It's not just about standing up for myself," she said. "It's about making sure this kind of behavior doesn't keep happening." Maria nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I'll never forget this," she said. Vanessa gave her a reassuring nod before turning to leave. As she walked through the terminal, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her expression thoughtful as she read the message. The story wasn't over yet, and Vanessa knew it. There were still loose ends to tie up, still steps to take to ensure that real change came from this experience. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The wheels were already in motion, and the lessons Richard Hale was about to learn would be impossible to ignore. The tension in the air lingered as Vanessa disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a scene that no one present would soon forget. Vanessa walked through the bustling Miami airport, her expression composed, but her mind racing. The events of the flight still lingered in the back of her mind, but she had learned long ago not to dwell on things she couldn't control. Richard Hale would face the consequences of his actions soon enough, and the system she trusted would take care of the rest. Also, she thought. As she approached the car waiting for her, a black SUV with tinted windows, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't one of reassurance. It was from someone in her inner circle, a trusted advisor who rarely overreacted. But the tone of this message was urgent. Asterisk, asterisk, there's more to this pilot than we thought. Call me as soon as you're clear. Asterisk, asterisk. Vanessa frowned as she slipped into the back seat of the car. She wasted no time dialing the number, her instincts telling her that something bigger was at play. The line connected after just one ring, and the voice on the other end was low and serious. "Vanessa, I've been digging into Richard Hale since you flagged him. Something about his history didn't sit right, and I was right to trust my gut," her advisor said, his words clipped and deliberate. "What did you find?" Vanessa asked, leaning forward in her seat, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. "More than I expected," he admitted. "He's been disciplined by the airline before, multiple times, but the records are buried deep. Complaints from passengers, questionable decisions in the cockpit, and even allegations of behavior that goes far beyond what you experienced. But here's the twist: he's been protected, every single time." Vanessa's grip tightened on her phone. Protected by whom? "That's where it gets murky," the advisor continued. "It seems someone high up in the airline has been pulling strings for him, keeping his record clean and making sure he stays in the air. I don't have names yet, but it's big, bigger than we thought. If this goes public, it could rock the entire airline. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her mind working quickly to process the information. She had expected fallout from the flight, but this was an entirely different level of complexity. The stakes were no longer just about her personal experience. They were about exposing a system that had been enabling someone like Richard for years. "Keep digging," she said firmly. "I need everything you can find. Names, dates, connections, everything. And do it quietly. I don't want this getting out until we're ready." As she ended the call, Vanessa stared out the window, her reflection in the glass looking back at her. She thought about the countless people who had likely suffered in silence because of Richard, people who didn't have the resources or the voice to stand up to someone protected by a system designed to shield him. The car pulled up to her hotel, a sleek and modern building with a private entrance for high-profile guests. Vanessa stepped out, nodding briefly to the driver, and made her way inside. The lobby was quiet, almost serene, but her mind was anything but. She had a meeting scheduled with her legal team in an hour, but before that, she needed a moment to center herself. She entered her suite, the door clicking shut behind her, and set her bag down on the glass table near the window. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. It was from the airline's corporate office, a formal apology for the incident on the flight, complete with assurances that an internal investigation was underway. But what caught her attention wasn't the apology itself, it was the name at the bottom of the email. The head of the airline's legal department, someone she had crossed paths with years ago during a business negotiation. Vanessa's instincts told her that this person might know more than they were letting on. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she walked over and checked the peephole. Standing outside was Maria, the flight attendant from earlier. Vanessa opened the door, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Maria," she said, "what brings you here?" Maria hesitated, clutching a small folder in her hands. "I wasn't sure if I should come, but after everything that happened, I felt like I had to. Can I come in?" Vanessa stepped aside, motioning for Maria to enter. The young woman looked nervous but determined, her hands gripping the folder tightly. "I wanted to thank you again," Maria began, her voice trembling slightly. "But also, I thought you should see this." She placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a collection of documents and photographs. Vanessa leaned in, her sharp eyes scanning the contents. There were internal memos, handwritten notes, and even a few candid photos of Richard with what appeared to be senior executives from the airline. The documents painted a clear picture of favoritism and cover-ups, with Richard's name appearing again and again. "Where did you get this?" Vanessa asked, her tone calm but insistent. Maria hesitated. "I've been with the airline for a while, and I've seen things that didn't sit right with me. After today, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. These are copies I kept for myself, just in case. I thought, maybe you could do something with them." Vanessa closed the folder, her mind racing. This was the kind of evidence that could blow the lid off the entire operation, but it also came with risks. If the airline found out Maria had taken these documents, it could cost her everything. "Maria, you realize what this could mean for you, right?" Vanessa said, her voice steady but serious. Maria nodded. "I do, but if it helps stop him, it's worth it." Vanessa placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, a rare gesture of warmth from someone who was usually all business. "You're brave, Maria, and I promise you, I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." As Maria left, Vanessa sat alone in her suite, the folder in front of her and the weight of the situation settling over her. She knew the next steps wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. The stakes had risen, the players had been revealed, and the game was far from over. Vanessa sat in the boardroom of her law firm the next morning, her legal team spread out around the table, reviewing the folder Maria had given her. The air was thick with tension as they analyzed the documents, connecting the dots and piecing together a narrative that was damning for the airline. Names were highlighted, timelines established, and patterns of misconduct revealed. It was no longer just about Richard Hale. It was about a deeply rooted culture of negligence and protectionism at the highest levels. One of her attorneys looked up, his brow furrowed. This is enough to make waves, but it's not airtight. The airline's legal team will fight back hard, and they'll discredit Maria if they find out she provided these. Vanessa nodded, her mind already working through the next steps. That's why we need to be strategic. We don't just take this to court, we take it to the public. If they try to silence this, they'll have to answer to more than just the law. As they finalized their plan, Vanessa's phone buzzed again. It was another message from her advisor. ***Q need to see this. Check your email. Intrigued, she opened her laptop and logged into her inbox. Her advisor had sent over a series of files, documents that hadn't been part of Maria's folder. They were confidential internal communications, leaked from someone even deeper inside the airline. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. These emails didn't just implicate Richard and his protectors, they implicated the airline's CEO. There were direct instructions to bury complaints, to dismiss employees who tried to report misconduct, and to ensure that Richard remained untouchable. The tone of the emails was cold, calculating, and unapologetic. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her mouse. This was the missing piece, the undeniable proof that would make it impossible for the airline to claim ignorance. But it also raised the stakes. Going up against the CEO wasn't just a legal battle, it was a declaration of war. Later that day, Vanessa held a press conference in one of the city's largest media venues. Cameras flashed, journalists crowded in, and a low hum of anticipation filled the room. Vanessa stood at the podium, calm and composed, as she addressed the crowd. She laid out the facts methodically, starting with her own experience and expanding to the systemic issues revealed by the evidence. "I'm not standing here today for myself," she said, her voice firm and clear. "I'm standing here for every passenger who was mistreated, for every employee who was silenced, and for everyone who believes that accountability should apply to everyone, no matter how high up the chain they are." As she spoke, the documents were displayed on screens behind her. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, their questions piling up as the scope of the scandal became clear. The press conference ended with Vanessa promising that this was just the beginning, that justice would be pursued relentlessly. But the day wasn't over. That evening, Vanessa received a call from an anonymous number. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her instincts on high alert. "Miss Carter," the voice on the other end said, smooth and practiced, "you've certainly made an impression." "Who is this?" Vanessa demanded, her tone sharp. "That's not important," the voice replied. "What is important is that you reconsider your course of action. You've made powerful enemies, and I'd hate for this to turn into something regrettable." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Is that a threat?" "Consider it a friendly warning," the voice said. "Walk away, and this all goes away. Push forward, and you might not like what you find." The line went dead before Vanessa could respond. She stared at her phone, her mind racing. The call had confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just about Richard or even the CEO. There were deeper forces at play, forces that were willing to go to great lengths to protect themselves. The following day, as the story exploded across news outlets, Vanessa received another unexpected twist. Maria called her in a panic, her voice shaking. "Vanessa, they fired me. They're saying I stole company property. They're threatening to sue me if I speak out." Vanessa felt a surge of anger, but kept her voice steady. "Maria, listen to me. They're trying to scare you into silence, but they don't have a leg to stand on. We'll protect you. Trust me." Maria hesitated before replying. "There's something else. I don't know if it's connected, but I noticed something strange before they escorted me out. There were men in suits going through the files in the office, files I've never even seen before. It looked like they were shredding documents. Vanessa's heart sank. The airline was scrambling, covering its tracks before the full weight of the evidence could come to light. But this move also confirmed their guilt. They wouldn't be destroying documents if they had nothing to hide. The next few days were a whirlwind of media coverage, legal maneuvers, and behind-the-scenes strategizing. Vanessa's team worked tirelessly to ensure that every piece of evidence was preserved, every whistleblower protected, and every angle of the story exposed. Just when it seemed like the momentum was fully on her side, the final twist came. An investigative journalist reached out to Vanessa with new information. They had uncovered a connection between the airline's CEO and a government official who had been quietly influencing aviation regulations. The official had ties to several other airlines as well, creating a web of corruption that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. Vanessa realized then that this wasn't just about one airline or one pilot. It was about an industry that had been allowed to operate without proper oversight for far too long. The fight she had started was no longer just her own. It was a fight for systemic change. As the news broke and the scandal widened, Vanessa felt a sense of resolve. She had walked into this battle thinking it was about one man's actions, but now she saw the bigger picture. The journey had been grueling, but she knew it was worth it. And as the headlines continued to roll in, one thing became clear. The world was watching, and there would be no going back. The fallout from the scandal was swift and unforgiving. News outlets from around the world covered the story extensively, with public outrage growing by the day. Richard Hale was suspended indefinitely, but the damage to his career was already done. The airline's CEO, after several days of public silence, was forced to step down amidst mounting pressure. The board of directors issued a statement, promising sweeping changes and a full investigation into the company's practices. But despite the high-profile resignations and apologies, Vanessa knew this was only the beginning. The hard part wasn't over. The public's attention was fleeting, and it would take more than a few resignations to fix the systemic problems that had allowed Richard Hale and others like him to operate unchecked for so long. She worked tirelessly with her legal team, pushing for real reforms and greater accountability in the aviation industry. She met with regulators, pushing for stronger oversight of airlines and demanding that whistleblower protections be strengthened. And while it would take years for real change to take root, Vanessa knew the fight was worth it. Her actions had forced the public to confront the ugly truth about the industry, and in doing so, she had become a symbol of the power of one individual to make a difference. Meanwhile, Maria, who had initially feared for her future, found herself slowly rebuilding her life. With Vanessa's legal team behind her, she was able to file a lawsuit against the airline for wrongful termination, and within a few months, she received a substantial settlement. But more importantly, she regained her confidence. She had become a voice for the voiceless, someone who had stood up in the face of fear and done the right thing. As she moved on from the airline, she decided to pursue a career as an advocate for workplace rights, determined to help others who had faced the same kind of injustice. As for Richard Hale, his fall from grace was complete. After being publicly exposed, he was stripped of his pilot's license and banned from flying by aviation authorities. The legal battles that followed were long and arduous, but in the end, he was found guilty of gross negligence, endangering the lives of passengers and more. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and his once promising career was reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Vanessa didn't celebrate his downfall, though. The whole process had taken a toll on her, and she knew that the victory wasn't about one man's punishment. It was about holding the entire system accountable. It was about making sure that the next person who came forward with a story of mistreatment wouldn't have to fight alone. She knew that real change required more than just one victory, and she remained focused on the long road ahead. Months later, Vanessa sat at a quiet cafe in Miami, sipping her coffee and reflecting on everything that had happened. The sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light on the table in front of her. Her phone buzzed, breaking the calm moment, and she picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her advisor. Vanessa, you did it. The board just released the new policies. There's a public apology coming tomorrow, and a task force will be set up to address systemic abuse in the aviation industry. This is bigger than we ever imagined. Vanessa smiled, the weight of everything she had been through settling into a sense of accomplishment. It hadn't been easy. She had risked everything, her reputation, her relationships, her own sense of safety. But in the end, it had been worth it. Not just for her, but for the countless others who would never have to face the same kind of injustice that Richard Hale had brought into her life. She set her phone down and took a deep breath. The fight had been exhausting, but it had also been transformative, and as she watched the world around her continue, she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones worth fighting the most. The world was changing, and she had been a part of that change. As she walked out of the cafe, her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a message from Maria. ***K, just wanted to say thank you again. I'm starting a new chapter in my life, and I couldn't have done it without you. ***. Vanessa smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. She had made a difference in one person's life, and in the process, she had changed the course of so many others. The road ahead would still be long, but she was no longer walking it alone. She looked up at the sky, the clouds rolling by as the sun dipped lower in the horizon. Whatever came next, Vanessa Carter was ready. What Richard didn't realize, what no one in that cabin realized, was who Vanessa Carter truly was. Not just her wealth or her influence, but the depth of her connections and the power she wielded. And now, as he stood before her, knees trembling, his once proud demeanor crumbled into desperation. The man who had strutted through the terminal mere hours ago was now begging for forgiveness in front of the very woman he had tried to humiliate. But what could have possibly happened in those 2 minutes to bring him to his knees? Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. Vanessa's calm demeanor as Richard hovered by her seat wasn't an act. She was no stranger to people trying to undermine her or make her feel small. After all, she'd dealt with it her whole life. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, Vanessa had learned early on that people often judged her for her skin color, her gender, or both. But she also learned something else, how to turn their underestimation into her strength. It started in high school, where she graduated at the top of her class despite having to juggle schoolwork and part-time jobs to help a single mother keep the lights on. It continued through college, where she earned a scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country and majored in business administration. By the time Vanessa was in her late 20s, she had founded a startup that disrupted the tech industry, becoming a name that not even the most seasoned executives could ignore. But what made Vanessa different wasn't just her intelligence or her ambition. It was her ability to remain poised in the face of adversity. She could walk into any room, no matter how hostile, and command respect. That's why, even as Richard stood in front of her, his words dripping with arrogance, Vanessa kept her cool. She had seen men like him before. The rest of the first-class cabin, however, was far from calm. Passengers whispered among themselves, unsure of whether to intervene or stay silent. Maria, the flight attendant, looked like she wanted to say something but froze, caught between her duty and the palpable tension in the air. Vanessa didn't need anyone to step in. She leaned back slightly in her seat and spoke in a tone so measured it could have frozen the entire plane. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing," she said, meeting Richard's gaze, "but I would advise you to be very careful about your next words." Richard smirked, clearly unfazed, or at least pretending to be. "Oh, is that so?" he said mockingly, crossing his arms. "And why is that?" Before Vanessa could respond, a man sitting a few rows behind her cleared his throat loudly. Everyone turned to look at him. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a tailored suit and a watch that looked like it could pay for a small house. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp, "but I don't think it's appropriate for the captain of this flight to be addressing a passenger in this manner." Richard shot the man a glare. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "Actually," the man replied, his tone firm. "It is my business. And I think you're forgetting that you're here to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone on this plane, not to single out and harass someone who's done absolutely nothing wrong." The passengers murmured in agreement, and Richard's expression faltered for a brief moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice rising, "but you have no idea what's going on here." Vanessa, meanwhile, remained silent. She didn't need to say anything. She could see the cracks forming in Richard's confidence, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the situation tipped in her favor. The co-pilot, a younger man named Eric, appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin, clearly alarmed by the escalating situation. "Captain Hale," he said cautiously, "we need to return to the cockpit." Richard ignored him. His focus was entirely on Vanessa now. "You think you're so untouchable, don't you?" he sneered, "sitting there like you own the world." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "I don't think I'm untouchable," she said calmly. "But I do think you're digging yourself into a hole you won't be able to climb out of." The co-pilot stepped forward, his voice more urgent this time. "Captain Hale, we have a situation that requires your attention," he said, glancing nervously at the passengers, who were now openly watching the confrontation. Richard finally turned to Eric, his expression dark. "Handle it yourself," he snapped. Vanessa took the opportunity to address him one last time. "I don't need to argue with you," she said, "but I will remind you that actions have consequences." Richard scoffed, shaking his head as he stormed back toward the cockpit. The tension in the cabin lingered even after he was gone. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, and Maria quickly approached Vanessa to apologize. "I'm so sorry for what just happened," Maria said softly, her voice trembling. "He's not usually like this." Vanessa gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's not your fault," she said, "but thank you for saying something." Maria hesitated, then added, "If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please let me know." Vanessa nodded. "I appreciate that." As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Passengers whispered about the incident, and several of them discreetly took to social media, posting about the altercation with vague captions hinted at the drama unfolding at 35,000 feet. Vanessa, however, stayed focused. She knew this wasn't over, and she wasn't about to let Richard's behavior slide. What he didn't realize was that Vanessa had connections that extended far beyond her financial success. Her influence reached into industries, governments, and even the aviation world. And while she wasn't one to throw her weight around unnecessarily, this situation warranted action. She tapped on her tablet, pulling up an email draft. She began typing, her words precise and deliberate. If Richard thought he could intimidate her, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Richard's frustration boiled over. Eric tried to reason with him, suggesting they focus on the flight and leave the incident behind, but Richard couldn't let it go. His ego wouldn't allow it. "She thinks she's better than everyone else," Richard muttered, gripping the controls tightly. Eric glanced at him, concern etched on his face. "Captain, this isn't the time for personal grudges," he said. "We have a job to do." But Richard wasn't listening. His mind raced, consumed by a mix of anger and humiliation. He couldn't shake the image of Vanessa sitting there, unbothered and composed, as if his words had no effect on her. Back in the cabin, Vanessa hit send on her email. She knew it would only be a matter of time before the wheels were set in motion. She leaned back in her seat, her expression calm, but her mind working swiftly. She wasn't the kind of person who sought revenge, but she was the kind of person who believed in accountability. As the flight approached its destination, the tension remained thick. Passengers continued to whisper, and Maria did her best to keep everyone calm. Vanessa, however, stayed silent, her focus unwavering. She didn't need to explain herself or justify her actions. She knew the truth would come to light soon enough. Richard, on the other hand, had no idea what was about to hit him.